Hello, Propenomix people, and welcome to another famous Propenomix Sunday Supplement Live. This week's was called No Tax, No Spend. And of course, that was a little hat tip towards what the Chancellor Rachel Reeves has promised in her upcoming spring statement. So let's see what happens, shall we? I'm sure a lot will be pleased if there aren't any taxes, and it will put a bit of confidence back into the business side of the economy. So if you've watched before, you'll know that I like to start with a quote. And this week's is, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. You might have heard that one before, but you might not know it was from Benjamin Franklin, the US founding father. Now, we're only 1 week away now from the next property business workshop, Tuesday, the 1st of April. The topic is due diligence. It's a massive one. I don't go a week without seeing an example or multiple examples of failed due diligence, which is either led to financial loss or is about to lead to financial loss. So that does need to be considered. There'll be a whole day on due diligence. It's back after popular demand. We did one about 12 months ago, where we also covered two other major topics. You have to bear with me today because I've got a bit of a persistent cough, but I decided instead of letting it defeat me, I'd still do the live. So please accept my apologies in advance for the coughing. So fresh content and ideas in this workshop. We're going to cover due diligence on business partners, suppliers, deals, lenders and borrowers, the health of companies and what you can and can't rely on from Companies House, liquidation, administration and receivership, deals with limited time or information available, credit ratings and how they really work, financial promotions and the FCA, and a live due diligence exercise on some individuals and companies using some online tools. Tickets have sold well. There's a few left at bit.ly/PBW6. There's also a link in the show notes. The early bird pricing is going to expire in about 4 hours' time if you're watching this live. So I would encourage you to get on with it and buy a ticket if you haven't already. And I hope to see you there. It'll be a fantastic room, as it always is. So welcome. If you use social media at all, which I assume you do because you're watching this or listening to it, and if you're connected with some like-minded souls, you won't have struggled to see plenty of posts about Gary Stevenson versus Daniel Priestley, which was on Stephen Bartlett's podcast, extremely lightly moderated by Stephen. It's a bit of a slog to watch the whole thing. It's a couple of hours. And I've given Gary's views some airtime, and I've given Gary a hard time on this channel and on my LinkedIn over the past year. But Gary has very much blown up and is blowing up, as they say. And there's bound to be more from him. He's heading on to 1 million subscribers now on his YouTube channel. Many will find his debating style, which is basically berating his opponent in between smatterings of telling everyone how clever he is, a little bit crude and difficult to watch or listen to. But his central message, in spite of it being built on absolute sand, is gaining traction. Tax the rich, but only those who are richer than Gary. He doesn't say the last bit, of course. But have a watch of the debate. Let me know what you think. If I had a target from building a YouTube channel, then it would be to debate Gary, because his opponents let him get away with economic stretches of the truth like I've never seen, because he knows the stats better than they do, or they assume that he does. But he makes mistake upon mistake upon mistake, or he tells outright falsehoods. I'm not sure which, but hopefully one day Propenomix will step up to the plate and get to debate Gary Stevenson. He often uses massive exaggerations to make a point. This isn't unusual in debating, of course. People do it all the time. But exaggerating or lying about the data really does not sit well with me, as you might imagine if you've ever watched any of my stuff before. So we know the spring statement is coming, and Rachel's promise, as I said, no tax, no spend. Do we believe it? Well, it feels unlikely to me. What really happens is there's tax by the back door, isn't there? There's tax by freezing thresholds and all the rest of it. There are some ridiculous articles out there suggesting that that's Labour's fault, given that Hunt and Sunak froze thresholds out till 2028, 29, basically the next election, while they were still in power. So what's Reeves supposed to have done? Unwound that and found the tens of billions of pounds it would cost, wherefrom a black hole was already big enough, as she was keen to point out. We've all had enough of all these black holes anyway, haven't we? We need to get on with business and with life. So in the deep dive this week, I just had to get into the Bank of England meeting. Of course I did. And that's our main point of focus in the deep dive, getting into the path of the interest rate, which is playing out very much as forecasted by me, I should say, not by many other commentators. But that reminds me why I put so much effort into this channel. The IFS also released a report about household wealth, which is pretty pertinent given that Stevenson versus Priestley is all about wealth and wealth inequality. So that gets some airtime in the deep dive as well. So into the real-time slot then, Chris Watkin and the Property Market Stats Show get rolling. We get to ask that question we simply have to know the answer to. What is currently happening in the UK property market? Chris released some great stats about overvaluing this week. Very powerful in my view. I shared them in real time, but they're worth repeating here. UK homes that sell in their first 25 days on the market, which really, if you're selling something, it really should always be your target. It's costly to hold stuff that's void. It's risky. There's insurance risks. There's potential leaks. There's all sorts of things that can happen, break-ins, etc., etc. They have a 94% chance of exchanging and completing on that sale. Hugely superior, a 6% fall through rate to a typical deal that has a 24% chance of falling through. That is the 7-year average, right? Now compare that then to homes that sell in over 100 days. They only have a 56% chance of exchanging and completing, or put another way, a 44% fall through rate. So compare 6% to 44, it's nearly 8 times as many. It's between 7 and 8 times as many times the chance of falling through. So what are the implications of sharing that? Well, if you're selling, get your price right the first time. You have one chance to make a first impression. A little bit cheesy, but it's true. If you're buying, well, concentrate on the stock that's been on the market over 90 or 100 days, particularly if it's come back to the market after a fall through, if the vendor really does want to sell it. Fascinating, though, because when I shared this in real time this week, large agencies have no qualms about overvaluing by 15%, locking people into a 6-month contract and chipping them down on the price as the 6-month rolls on. Thanks to Mike Sharp, who shared that, which is a direct quote from a CEO of a large company. He didn't name them, but we can probably guess one of 2 or 3 that it is. Who was happy to say that at a nationwide conference to everybody. Get them locked in for 26 weeks, 15% over what you think it's going to sell for, and chip, 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 chip. It's just disgusting, to be honest with you, and no wonder people don't trust the estate agents. Now, we're into week 10 of 2025 on this data report because we run 1 week behind. But it's as close to real time as we're going to get. And we see the listings data continuing to revert back towards the mean. 2025 is still the biggest start to the year for listings since 2016, if not before. Chris's data only goes back to 2017. How will it continue to play out as we approach the new world of higher stamp duty all round for anything above £125,000? Well, 12% of stock continues to be reduced compared to 2024's average, which was a market of more stock than normal anyway. That was 12.1, the average last year, but the 5-year average is 10.6 for reductions. So more stock, more reductions, both in absolute terms and in percentage terms. Gross sales are still just ahead of 2022, which was a really hot start to the year, remember, and 14.8% ahead of the last year at the same point. But what will the cool down be after this 31st of March stamp duty deadline? Well, Skipton released a cashback product in the last week to put cash back in buyers' pockets so they can find that extra stamp duty, which seemed at the very least like a good piece of marketing. The net sales dipped just below 2022's number, but they're still the highest apart from 21 and 22 in the sample by some margin. As at the 1st of March, there were 675,186 properties on the market in the UK. That's the most by a chunk. That number, for a 1st of March number anyway, that number was 623k last year on the 1st of March and 628k on the 1st of March 2019. On the 1st of March 2022, it was only 399,915. So a huge difference in the availability of stock. 7.5% more than the previous high, which was pre-pandemic. And February's final pound per square foot figure was £340 a foot, down from 342 in Jan. So it supports those wobbly market readings we've seen from Nationwide and Halifax and people like that. I always like to give Chris a weekly shout out because he's more prolific than only this epic tome he releases weekly on the UK property market. He fires out great stats on a regular basis. Drop him a like, a subscribe, and all the rest of it, and some kind words for his content creation. If you're in the industry and you want a ghostwriter, because that's his core business, give him a shout. His article gets published on the Property Industry Eye website every week, and the video goes on his YouTube channel at Christopher Watkin. So thanks, Chris, for what you do. So the legendary macro segue is upon us as we drift across into the news of the week. Unemployment figures have to get an outing, although questions over the accuracy of the ONS were blown up this week when it was revealed that, apart from anything else, UK household wealth was shaved by over £2 trillion. Unemployment figures haven't been reliable, well, basically since COVID. And we'll also get into the Rightmove asking price index and the ONS report on first-time buyer mortgage sales before we round off with, you know what, the gilts and the swaps. But we can only analyse what the official body says, and here we go. Labour market report. Unemployment's not been playing along with what we're seeing in the PMIs as far as the official figures go. We're still going back to January here in this report, but we'd have expected a miserable month. It isn't uncommon in the UK, however, to see skills or labour hoarding by companies. Getting rid and starting again isn't something we love doing. So perhaps it's just a symptom of that phenomenon that seems ingrained into our culture. Hold on, let's wait and see, and let's see if we can, rather than go out and recruit new people, which is expensive, right, and train them with new skills. Perhaps we can just hold on to what we've got and hope that things get a little bit better. And I think we've been doing a bit of that, realistically. But the headline rate of unemployment stuck at 4.4%. I prefer to look at employment, which is 75%, leaving 21.5% economically inactive. Well, that's what the ONS tells us, although that doesn't add up to 100%, of course, which is typical. But there are rounding errors allowed. So 6.14 million of 36.9 million workforce jobs are in the public sector. Vacancies seem to have stabilised. There are 816,000, according to the ONS. Earnings growth is always a big one. Average regular earnings are still at 5.9%. So that stacks up nicely, even with the inflation adjustment at 3.9, because the ONS prefers to adjust things by CPIH, which includes housing. So after adjustment, that comes out at 2.2% real-time growth. Lovely and sustainable if the economy is growing accordingly, of course, which it isn't. So what happens in this situation, as an aside, is that labour workforce get better returns than capital does overall. Well, that would be a bit of rebalancing. That would be right up Carrie's street, to be honest. Although he doesn't ever talk about income inequality, really. He's just obsessed with wealth. But that's a rebalancing that's welcome, I'd suggest, after COVID, and also a rebalancing that is absolutely typical after a pandemic. We'd still be better off if the economy was growing, though. But the report doesn't make for bad reading, especially compared to what I was expecting compared to the PMI reports. I still struggle to believe that PMIs are not a fair reflection of what companies are doing, which just suggests there will be a typical lag effect of unemployment rising slowly, but continually throughout the year. Let's hope I'm being overly bearish. We may well have a classic ONS revision before then. I think unemployment will be about 4.8 by the end of this year. Maybe the ONS revision will make me look stupid. I mean, I hope it does make me look stupid on the upside as a forecaster, not on the downside. The quarterly figures look flat, but not bad. And that's our first completed quarter since that budget that's been reported on. So we'll take flat, I think, realistically. Now, historically, I haven't given Rightmove stats a lot of airtime because I haven't really rated their analysis, but it's a bit of a big company to draw a line through, I think, given they're the market leaders. And also, I do think the analysis has got a bit better over time. So I have decided to give them a bit of a slot in the supplement on occasion. They produce a house price index monthly and talk about asking prices, which are, of course, as discussed, very different from transacted prices, but in that way can also offer a different slant on analysis. It also says more about the confidence of agents and vendors, you would think, and then in a secondary way, talks about the state of the market. Headline stats, asking price increases 1.1% a month, but only 1% this year, with sales agreed up 9% year on year. The average asking price of property coming to market, 371,870. There's more stock to choose from since 2015, Rightmove tells us. There's a massive logjam, according to them, of 575,000 moves in the legal completion process. New sellers are 8% up on last year as well. So they prefer to use the average 5-year fixed mortgage rate, which is not a bad proxy at all. And they report that as 4.74%. It won't be the same as the draw. It's not as good as the drawn rate, which the Bank of England report upon, because, of course, many more mortgages are written at the top end of the market where the prices are lower because people are price sensitive. So that 4.74 is a bit of an overestimate, but it's not the worst Not the worst tool in the world for a bit of real-time reporting, down from 4.84 12 months ago. Now, not a lot's driven that really, apart from competition, because as reported for weeks, gilts are higher and swaps are identical compared to 12 months ago. But they're all down from this July 2023 pinnacle, which on that measure there, the average 5-year fixed mortgage rate, 6.11. That was ugly times indeed. So anyone who fixed around then, I feel for you. Right, they then passed those asking prices by market sector, excluding inner London. I like this distinction. First time buyer average asking prices up 0.7% year on year. Second steppers up 1.3% year on year. And 1.3% also the increase for the top of the ladder, where they see the average asking price at £673,111. I imagine particularly the top of the ladder is prone to being corrupted by very large listings, if indeed they go on Rightmove, because of course a lot of that stuff happens off market. Asking prices still aren't back to where they were in May 24. The big drops in the past 12 months in the asking prices were August, November and December. Always the way. 2024 reverted, as I said at the time, back to more standard seasonal variation territory. If you pick 3 months of the year you were going to buy properties in, August, November and December, without a shadow of a doubt. Then there's a lovely couple of visuals I shared as this week's images, so you can find them on the Propenomix newsletter, on my LinkedIn, or you can find them on the Partners in Property blog as well. Ripped them both from the Rightmove report, very informative. First-time buyer affordability and the average spend on a first-time buyer home. We still need desperately, industry people, if you're listening, stop comparing rent to mortgages. They are not the same thing. Rent includes maintenance, insurance and the likes, but nonetheless, it is still a powerful visual because apart from anything else, it shows that rent is quite a lot more affordable than mortgage. This is before we enter into discussions about deposits and all the rest of it as well, right? But still, it was pretty good work from Rightmove, and I'm glad that I've shared it all in all, and I feel a little bit guilty. I haven't done that in the past. So yes, so many indices, so little time, but there'll be a bit more Rightmove in future, I'm sure. So the ONS is first time publishing first-time buyer mortgage data at the local authority level. An unsurprising conclusion. The largest falls in sales in first-time buyer mortgage sales in London were in London between 2013 and 2023. Now, I've referred to this conclusion before, but let's put a bit more meat on the bones, okay? Zoom out into some of my own analysis here. It's fairly incredible, and no one would have predicted it, or no one did predict it that I know of, that interest rates would normalise in such a relatively short period of time, and there wouldn't be a horrific impact on the price of UK property. Even in 2021, I was expecting the fight against inflation to be a really difficult one because rate setters would not want to put the interest rates up because they didn't believe the economy was ready. But of course, what happened is they were pushed into a situation where they had to. They didn't have any other choices. QE would not have been the way forward. They had to put the rates up, right? So that's where we got to. But you could go from sort of October 2022, that's your weekly mention there, Liz, to July 2023, which is a period of only 10 months. No time at all in central banking terms. You know, there's probably 7 meetings scheduled in that 10 months, that's all. And the underlying 5-year gilt rate on the UK government bonds basically doubled. And I don't mean it went from 0.1 to 0.2. It went from under 2.5 to 5, right? Big deal. Expectations would be more carnage, really, if you looked at that before the event. But instead, very high inflation actually papered over the cracks. The market didn't crash at all. It adjusted a couple of percent on ONS figures during that time period, but a massive adjustment in real terms after inflation. Inflation did the vast majority of the heavy lifting. However, where did it leave us? Well, in a world where if you wanted a traditional buy-to-let style product, that lending criteria at 6.11 average 5-year mortgage from the Rightmove Index there, that would have been personal name, remember? That would have been an individual residential mortgage, not a buy-to-let. So you'd have been 7% plus for limited companies, which indeed you were. Now, by regulatory standards, remember, you need 125% rental coverage. So you'd have to have a rental yield at 8.75 to get a 75% loan to value product. And no, you don't always have to get 75% loan to value. You can have 60, 50, 40 or none. Around half the property, remember, investment property in the UK is not encumbered at all. But cash buys don't normally generate incredible returns and don't use the power of leverage. So it crushed the attractiveness of the asset class, right? Because if you can't get really strong leverage returns, why bother in this environment? Let's face it. So go back to that 8.75 with not much of a price adjustment, and rental increases were there, but they weren't rip-roaring like they are today on the existing stuff, right? So there wouldn't have been much buy-to-let in the country that would have ticked that box. You were talking Middlesbrough. You certainly wouldn't have had HMO in inner London. They wouldn't have been meeting 8.75, and I'm talking gross before bills, right? Let alone buy-to-let. So the industry took a breath, and it had to wait. Things had to calm, and calm they did. I've observed a number of times, for all the noise, the 5-year swap rate has not moved much in the last 12 months, or a little bit beyond that. That's enough for us to declare calm, stability, but also we're well into the new world, and we have a baseline. Now, that baseline is 6% for debt interest for limited companies. I've said it time and again, if you're a regular watcher or listener. We could, and it's a stretch, say that investors are comfortable with paying 5% with a 5% fee on a 5-year fix. So really simple maths. I just amortize that 5% fee, 1% each year, and that comes back to the 6% rough cost, right? Now, it's a stretch. I don't think if you spoke to many investors, let me know what you think in the comments, that they're comfortable paying a 5% fee. They feel it's a big rip-off, but there isn't much margin over and above the cost of capital, and these lenders need margin, their businesses, right? So they've got to be effective. They were making more like a 3% margin in 2021, and now they're down to 2% margins in 2025. But still, I'm trying to make an argument, and I'm trying to steelman that argument, right? So stay with me on the 5+5 rule there. Using the interest coverage rules, you can now have buy-to-let at 6.25% minimum yield if you want a 75% mortgage. Now, there's a world of difference between 8.75 and 6.25, and yields have roared forward since that point in time in July 2023, right? Capital values down, rents massively forward, capital values suffered a bit first, and then they repaired a bit, as we know, in 2024. But as we said, inflation did a huge amount of heavy lifting. So 6.25 still isn't to be sniffed at. If you go back to the days of 3% mortgages and you use my logic, you could happily invest in stuff that yielded 4%. That is totally off the table these days, in my opinion, if you're using leverage or you've got any kind of goal other than significant capital growth or just wealth protection because you want super quality assets. And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, depends where you are in your life cycle, in your investment life cycle, right? But if the average London property is 550k and the average rent is 2,200 quid, that yields 4.8. If you need 6.25, you've got to go a long way along the curve, haven't you, in order to get to that 6.25 to make it work in London. Can you do it? Of course you can, if you're a professional. And going back to HMO and the likes, is it doable for the masses who want to turn up in the estate agent, buy something and rent it and be able to get a 75% mortgage? Nope, no chance, right? What does that do on an investment front, or what has it done? Well, it forces investors out of the capital and mostly ships them north, sometimes a long way north. Right, the rules don't work the same way in normal residential mortgages, but the impact is similar. You're stress tested currently at this rate of 8 to 9% on your resi mortgage, which is ridiculous in my view, and very possibly being changed very soon, perhaps this week. Let's wait and see. I'm not sure how long it's going to take the FCA and the PRA to play ball on that front, but it does look likely. But your 4.5 times combined salary, which could be more because even under the current rules, 15% of the mortgage book of new loans can be above 4.5 times combined. That needs to look like about 110 grand, the combined salary, times 4.5 gets you a loan of 495, which is 90% of 550. That loan at 4.25% cost, let us say at the moment, costs 2150 a month on a repayment loan, and that's with a 40-year amortization profile. At the stress rate of 9%, you need to be able to afford 3,826 per month to be approved for that loan, or a tiny bit shy of 46 grand a year. So let's say you're ideal couple for this loan in London and you earn 55 grand each to get to that 110. Let's be realistic and suggest you've also got a student loan and you pay 5% into your pension. So you take home 3,193 each per month. You've got a household income net of tax of 6,400 quid. So if you haven't got any other debt, you can definitely afford it on the stress test rates, just about, in spite of a very nice household income. So herein lies the root cause of the problem. The average London household has got a gross weekly household income of about 16% higher than the UK average, right? About 750 quid, not the 6,200 or 6,400 we were talking about there, right? So they're nowhere near. So if you take London out of the UK figures, you'd find they're about 18% ahead of the rest of the UK. But the house prices aren't 18% ahead of the average. They're more like 80 or 90% ahead of the average. And again, a bit more again if you remove London from that base population, right? Now, that doesn't even say anything about the 55 grand deposit that you need and the stamp duty and the likes that also needs to be saved up, of course, the legals, blah, blah, blah. Then consider at the average you can pay $2,150 a month on a mortgage, or on average you can pay $2,200 rent. Yes, some of that $2,150 is going into paying down the mortgage. After 10 years, for example, you'll have paid off, you'll have made 264 grand in mortgage payments, and you'll have paid just under 58 grand of the debt off. So you've still paid 206 grand in rent to the bank if you look at it that way. In this new world after April the 1st, that transaction will cost 12.5k in stamp duty and inevitably 2.5 grand in lawyers' fees with a free arrangement or a bit of cash back or all this stuff you get if you're a resi buyer. So 58k of your debt payment has been chipped to 43k that you're better off by that 15 grand you're going to put in up front. Or your 55 grand deposit has improved to 98k over the course of a decade. That's about 6.5% a year. So not even as good as your average stocks and shares ISA if the 55 grand had gone in there. Now, in old money terms, that was never a worry because house prices just go up and up, right? And that's only the first decade, so only 10 years. And the first is the worst in terms of capital versus interest when you're doing repayment loans. But London hasn't ticked the up and up box for some time. Since 2014, peak help to buy, 5% deposits and the like. Many have not recouped stamp duty or even purchase price when they've come to sell 10 years later. You have to wonder how that affects confidence to buy as well. As the London peak in pricing was 2014 to 2016, depending on which part you're talking about, perhaps it isn't a fair comparison. But to suggest it wouldn't have affected confidence in London property would be silly. So, back to the ONS report. That doesn't cover the entire time period in the ONS report in question here. But the time frame does represent when the new mortgage market review and stress test rules really bit. How much confidence fed into all of this? Much more of a newer phenomenon. Where was the growth in first-time buyer mortgages in 2023? Well, the largest growth was in the northeast, and in Northern Ireland. Now, I've made a feature over the past 18 months or so of the fact that the first-time buyer part of the market has been the one that is the most robust. They're the most motivated, and they still believe in the property price going up in the long term ad infinitum. They can also make better gains than in the London example of rent versus mortgage. This is where the figures get interesting, but they also get a little confusing. First-time buyer mortgages peaked in number in 2021. That'll be no surprise when you think about the interest rate at that time, yeah. And 2023 was the worst year since 2013, and it went to 282,000. Now, those who listen regularly know that I love context with data. In 2009, 10 and 11, that number was under 200,000 a year. So that's how much worse it was. But just because they fell in number, they actually increased in proportion. So in 2023, 38.4% of all property sales went to first-time buyers. In 2013, that number was only 28%. So the most motivated continue to move even through what looked like a very tough or down market. Perhaps won't surprise anybody. People still play the long game, and longer than my decade example above, right? And of course, they won't lose versus renting over that time frame. But it takes that deposit, that millstone around the neck of the mortgage, and even there in that whole example, I haven't included insurance, I haven't included household improvements, maintenance, and the likes. I haven't included all of that, which makes the case for renting even stronger and the case for buying even weaker when you're looking at such huge investments up front as you are in London. Now, what often takes that argument away, of course, is the bank of mum and dad, because the bank of mum and dad come in and you haven't saved the 55 grand. They'll lend you the 50k or whatever, but they won't give it to you. They're not going to give it to you to waste if you're in rented property, as they're going to look at it. They'll give it to you to invest in a house because they know you need help to get on the housing ladder, right? So again, it's not supposed to be a perfect comparison. There is no such thing, right? But so the most motivated continued to move, right? And you could argue also the long-term mentality has started to unwind a little bit. Now you've got 40-year repayment profiles as standard versus a 25 to 30-year approach maybe from a decade ago. And that would make a legitimate difference. You've also, I think, got a society that wants to move and do things more quickly these days and doesn't have as much patience as it did 10 years ago. Now, whether that's caused by smartphones, social media, and the likes, different conversation, which I'd love to get into one day, but it's outside the scope of the supplement. So 2023's share of first-time buyer mortgages for homes in the capital was 12.8%, and that was down from 16.8 in 2013. So a significant drop by about a quarter, right? Compare that to the southeast, which had the highest proportion of first-time buyer mortgages by 2023, and that was 13.8. So were people trading off being able to own for distance? How much is hybrid working made that a difference as well? Of course it has, right? But in terms of rates of mortgage per 1,000 dwellings, one area in London was in the top 10. In 2013, 6 areas out of the top 10 were all in London. So that's the level of the difference. The top 10 actually is interesting. Nuneaton and Bedworth, local to me, in third, for example. Swindon, one of the most affordable places that's close enough to London, up to 5th. Milton Keynes in 6th. Knowsley, northeast Liverpool, the only other non-southeast place to make the top 10, was in 9th. The biggest mover downwards was Tower Hamlets, 17.7 mortgages per 1,000 dwellings for first-time buyers in 2013, down to 10.6. So nearly halved in proportion, right? The graphics in the report show a dramatic shift in percentage of homes or dwellings bought by first-time buyers in London, with no local authorities showing an increase. Then the next areas decay are the southwest, the southeast, and the east. And the east still looks just about positive, with St Albans and Cambridge leading the charge in seeing fewer and fewer first-time buyers, which won't surprise anyone simply because of the pricing around there. But the rest of the UK shows a dramatic improvement in comparison. So people are going to cheaper locations, or in cheaper locations, they are more likely to buy. And in more expensive locations, they are less likely to buy. You could say, big surprise, Chief, well done. But it's all evidence of what we might suspect, whereas most of the stuff that goes in the media is speculation and frankly nonsense, right? But when we look deeper, these areas of growth are actually outside of major cities. There are fewer first-time buyers in England's most urban areas. It's a shame we have to discuss only as recently as 2023 in a report that got released in March 2025, but that's the game on the more minority or special interest issues, I'm afraid. The ONS need everyone they've got, and a lot of consultants apparently, they're paying millions of pounds a week on that at the moment, to try and fix the unemployment reporting issues other than anything else before I even start on this 2 trillion evaporation in the deep dive. So, bit of a big segue there, but hopefully interesting and useful, particularly for those who are raising some future first-time buyers. Circling back round into the gilts and swaps for the week. The open was at 4.29 on the 5-year yield, and then closed at 4.349, which was very nearly the week-long high. Now, nobody likes a week where it closes on a high because it feels like it's going to go higher next week. But the Bank of England commentary that accompanied the meeting was really the reasoning behind this. And I'll talk a bit more about this in the deep dive when I get into the Bank of England meeting. The swaps saw Thursday's close in the 5-year gilt yield at 4.326 and the resulting swap at 3.975% yield, just holding off below that 4% barrier. It's strange to note that discount of 35 bips has really been preserved to keep the swap rate very similar to the past month. 3.95 1 month ago, 3.811% 1 year ago. And that's exactly that stability that I've been talking about, leading me to proclaim this 6% as the gospel debt rate for buy-to-let. Now, this is why I think 7.5% is the minimum level of buy-to-let yield that really works these days in terms of debt service. And I prefer 8.5% plus myself, because in my operation, there's significant operational costs and reinvestment in properties to build sinking funds for things like EPC improvements and goodness knows whatever else the government are going to throw at us over the coming years. But to get into any of the why, we can't any longer delay the discussion of the Bank of England MPC meeting Thursday last week. Let's get the lowest hanging fruit out the way. This one was a hold. Very, very easy to predict. The outlier last time, Catherine Mann, who was a hawk and had been voting upwards or to hold for the vast majority of her time on the MPC, she'd voted for a 0.5% cut last time out when we ended up with a 0.25% cut. Now, Dr. Swati Dhingra, the lifer of all doves, always voting to cut or not raise, was always going to vote for a cut here. But she voted for a cut of 0.25%. Last time out, she voted for 0.5%. But Mann came back into line, realising, I believe, she might have shot her bolt a little last time out. Or the facts have changed, so she changed her mind, which any sensible policymaker would do. We've not heard from her directly since the meeting, so we can only speculate. But for what it's worth, it's clear to me she's already done the right thing coming back into line. My prediction of 2 cuts this year, the prediction I made back in December, having already had one by now, looked like it was in trouble last month, but I've stuck with it. As at today, to me, it still looks the most sensible. A poll that I've run on LinkedIn since the meeting disagrees a little bit and thinks that there will be 2 more cuts this year, not 1. But it's pretty close in the poll between 2 and 1 cuts, and I think it's appropriately close. I'm sticking with 1. I appreciate there could be 2, but I still think there'll be 1, and I think it'll be in the second half of the year. But let's also get the undiscussed out of the way, the bit that makes people really nervy. There were no votes to put the rates up. Now, the occasional voice does think that we should, and they aren't entirely without merit, although the concept they're really missing, in my view, is that rates went up about 1% or so, more than they should have done in the risk management stage of the base rate rising. This is exactly why the settlement in the swap rates has been about 4% in the past 18 months or so, because that's where the neutral rate of interest lies. The base rate, 3-month rate, really, to think about it in that way, isn't the same as the 5-year gilt, of course, and in the normal time would be below the 5-year gilt rate, which is why a lot of people think the natural rate is closer to 3.5% at the moment. Remember, that natural rate is the rate at which the economy would not be growing or shrinking due to monetary policy, due to the setting of the base rate or quantitative easing, right? I think the natural rate, and it's an ethereal concept. No one can prove anyone right or wrong. It really matters what everybody thinks and predicts, yeah? I think it's more like 4% at the moment, which would imply a flat yield curve, right? But I'm factoring in a 3% inflation world into my prediction. I'm not still stuck pretending we're in a 2% inflation world, which we're not. The most important part of the meeting then after the results is the summary. This is the bit the committee knows will be scrutinised, examined and picked apart in detail. What matters here is everything. The operators and or can make a huge difference, right? The order of the paragraph, the punctuation, everything. I cannot emphasise that enough. So the summary this month, which bear in mind, this is a meeting that doesn't produce a quarterly report, so it's somewhat lighter. It's been some time since a non-report meeting actually yielded a change in the rates, because no report means no official updated forecasts. It doesn't mean they ignore what's happened since the last meeting. Indeed, Catherine Mann has not ignored the event since February's meeting, and she's changed her vote accordingly. But it does mean there's much more limited evidence for them to go on than in the quarterly meetings when they do have a new report and new forecasts, right? So the first comment is around the preservation of February's conclusion that the past 2 years have shown significant progress on disinflation. Well, look, that's true, isn't it? We were at 11% plus CPI in October 2022, and we're back down in the 3%, and indeed we hit 1.7 last September. They praise themselves for keeping monetary policy restrictive, keeping the rates high, and talk of how that has stabilised longer-term inflation expectations. What it's stabilised those expectations around, though, is another matter. As I say, 3%, not 2%. But they use the word gradual about the easing of restraints and talk about squeezing out persistent inflationary pressures. The conclusion that the market has drawn here, with the gilts closing at weak highs on the yield after this chatter, is that there's a tacit admission here that inflation most definitely is persistent. And that's a departure, particularly from Catherine Mann's stance after the last meeting, where she basically said she thought the worst of the persistent pressures were over. Then, of course, there's talk of tariffs, my favourite word, uncertainty globally, and the German government's significant reform to its fiscal rules, which is a direct shot at the Chancellor, I'd say, perhaps suggesting she should do the same. Although, remember, she's already changed them once when she came into power. They then referred to UK GDP growth estimates being slightly stronger than expected in February. I must have missed that one, although I did discuss last week that NISA had forecasted 0.4% growth in February. Personally, I'm not having it. They also temper that chat with a reference to the PMIs and the business survey indicators, which are bearish, as I've been reporting on for 6 months or so. They haven't changed their expectation of inflation around 3.75 in September or so, and that looks a reasonable forecast, just as it did at the last meeting. They're also not bad at inflation prediction in more stable times. It's actually one of their strengths. I wouldn't move 0.25% in either direction on that prediction for September's rate. It looks roughly right to me. I'd agree with the forecast. The timing is tough, though, because September's low print of 1.7 sets the scene for a high print in September just because of the way the calculations work. Base effects is the technical term if you want to go and look it up. They also added one more rider to their approach going forward. They're now gradual and careful. Now, that doesn't really mean anything other than using two adjectives rather than one. So they're purely there for emphasis. Therefore, the bond markets are bound to react by hardening on yields because it sounds like rates will go down even more slowly than anyone had already rationalised. But then there's a rider which is needed because they don't want economic agents thinking they would be one-dimensional. They talk of greater or longer-lasting weakness in demand relative to supply, not as a given, but as a what-if. And if that happens, they will drop rates more quickly. However, there's a reminder no one else wants, that if demand exceeds a restricted supply for any reason, if there was more inflation on the back of that, rates would have to increase, not decrease. They finish with a pretty hawkish conclusion. Rates remaining high for sufficiently long until the risks of not getting back to 2% have dissipated further. So that's where the bank's at for this cycle. Next meeting, 8th of May. It will be a quarterly full report meeting. So until then, it's a case of watching, including watching the spring statement and processing the OBR forecast update, which could be a disaster. At the very least, it will be economic doom and gloom headlines next week in the press. So buckle up. Okay, the slightly shorter Bank of England write-up leaves room for a chat about the IFS report, Institute for Fiscal Studies, on the back of the ONS revising down UK household wealth by over £2 trillion. That shorthand doesn't really give it the impact it deserves. The whole number is 2,200,000,000,000, so 2,200,000,000,000,000. 2 twos, 11 zeros. Totally unfathomable money. Now, a quick reminder, the IFS are pretty much the most respected, most central economic think tank. There's a limited agenda in what they publish, and you can tell this because they upset people on the left and the right in equal measure. That's the only real way to gauge a true centrist or heterodox thinker, I always think. So they're worth listening to. It doesn't put them beyond challenge, but it does give them a place deserving of respect. So what has the ONS done here? Well, they've made 3 changes to the methodology that they use to value private pensions. What's the result been? A £2.2 trillion adjustment downwards in the value of pensions. A 14% decrease. What do the IFS think? Well, spoiler alert, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but they think the third one is an absolute car crash and may well be even more wrong than it already was. There was an error in the way they calculated inflation. Yes, really. That error put the value up by about 500 billion. Easy enough. They've then improved estimates of the age at which people can draw their pensions. Well, that sounds reasonable because ages have moved around a bit and there's a bit more guidance about how they'll move in the future these days. So that's removed about 300 billion from the total. He giveth and he taketh away, right? Now, the rest is all about calculating the future income and turning into today's terms. In big dog investment, we would call this the net present value or similar. This is where the IFS loses their cool. What's the detail? A move away from using market interest rates. Now, a net present value needs a discount rate. Some listening to this will be familiar with discounted cash flow. If you aren't familiar with DCF, I'd recommend doing some research on the topic because it's very powerful getting your head around DCF. And towards using a measure of forecast GDP growth, fundamentally flawed and inconsistent with all other assets, they say. What's the result here? A serious change in the distribution of wealth. It sees wealth in the 25 to 34 bracket up by 11%. The aforementioned Gary Stevenson will be spitting feathers, although I'll never discuss this on his channel because it doesn't support his argument. And that change comes from the errors that were corrected. It puts the 2018 to 2020 total wealth for the 65 to 74 age group down by 38%, though. Now, that is a massive shift. The IFS are losing their mind because this informs policy significantly, and that's why I'm discussing it, right? And if it's erroneous and leads to even more pensioner-friendly policies, and let's face it, you can't really accuse Labour of that so far, then that's a significant error in their eyes, and I would have to agree with the IFS. So the final conclusion here is that official statistics do not paint a reliable picture of the inequality of wealth between young and old, which is a huge topic of conversation, as it already has been at the moment, and incredibly important for setting appropriate policy. Now, the report does go into further detail, as you can imagine, but it really is beyond the scope of what I think you guys and girls will find interesting, in my personal opinion. right? It comes down to the difference between valuing the defined pension contributions and the defined benefit pensions, usually known as final salary in the old days. And those are dying off, of course, apart from in the public sector. I tried to rack my brains and work out whether there's a sinister government agenda here, but these liabilities are covered up by creative accounting anyway, so I don't really see it. I just think it is good that we have organisations like the IFS who are going to hold the ONS to account when they make a mistake, as it sounds like they've done here, and frankly, as they do all the time. We are internationally respected for our statistics, or we were. We seem like everything else since COVID is in a complete bloody mess. So, as an aside, pensions did hold roughly similar value before this revision to the net value of the UK residential property market owned by individuals. About 6.4 trillion net the pensions were worth in 2018 to 2020. But now that's been revised, obviously, to 4.2 trillion. And so the property market's well ahead, as it was sitting around that 6 trillion level in those years in question. So regardless of how those first-time buyers in London are thinking, or however they make their decisions as a group, property always wins in the end, eh? So as we move to conclusion, remember, if you haven't already got a ticket for the 1st of April due diligence workshop, property business workshop, it will be the most comprehensive day on due diligence ever to have been delivered in the property space. I will guarantee it. Get your final tickets at bit.ly/PBW6. There's only 3 hours left now until those early birds expire. And above all, please remember, keep calm, always listen to or read the supplement and carry on, because there's going to be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030. And the risks around at this time, while they might feel significant, some of the geopolitical ones are far less meaningful to the UK housing market than the risks have been for several years. Of that, I have no doubt. Thank you and good luck. Now, just at the end, I've had one comment on YouTube that I just want to bring up because it might be of interest. And it's from L4D. Thank you. And it's about Gary Stevenson, so I'm going to enjoy this one. Thanks for leaving the comment. I hope you're still listening, L4D. He says, Adam, or he or she says, what annoys me with Gary is the lack of mention of the debasement of currency role in the, I assume they mean the point around wealth inequality. So 1 house equals 1 house, 1 ounce of gold equals 1 ounce of gold. So what the point that they're trying to make there is, if you valued houses in gold, if you valued houses in dollars, if you valued houses in Bitcoin, and then there's a number of different ways to do this, but actually purchasing power is down significantly. And another way of framing that point, which is obviously accurate, especially when the price of gold is $3,000, which is all-time highs, obviously. Another point that really sets that out is that if you adjust the house prices in the UK by RPI inflation, they haven't gone up for about 22 years now. They've kept pace with RPI, extremely sustainable. And indeed, wages are actually better versus house prices than they were 10 years ago. Now, I've done lots of talking about this over the past weeks and months, and you've got various points around the fact that, well, you know, over the last 30 years, houses are much more expensive compared to wages. But I've made the point that that was primarily concertinaed into those first 10 or 15 years. And then, of course, there was a big adjustment in 2007, 2008, 2009. But there was also a big adjustment downwards to wages to start with. But you do have, compared to 10 years ago, more people in the 25 to 34 age bracket owning a house. It's much better than most people think it is. It's not as hard to buy as people think it is. It is a minority. Most people are renting. That's absolutely true. And like always, it requires significant sacrifice to buy your first house, unless you're lucky enough that mum and dad are going to sort it out for you, which annoys Gary quite a lot, of course. But then the mums and dads out there listening to this who can afford to do that do make that point. But, nominal house prices are the constant source of headlines. What would Halifax, Nationwide, Lloyds, Rightmove, Zoopla do if they weren't talking about nominal house prices? It's all they talk about to get headlines and clicks. And nominal prices are useless. There's no point talking about nominal prices when you're comparing them to GDP, for example, because GDP is adjusted for CPI inflation, right? So it doesn't make any sense to do that. It doesn't make any sense to do it compared to GDP per capita, because that's still adjusted for inflation. You have to start using nominal for nominal if you're going to do that and make those comparisons. And the problem with that is it doesn't make people like Gary's argument any better. It doesn't support his argument. It attacks his argument. It undermines his argument. But of course, he never wants to hear that. And then he'll just start talking about how he's Citibank's best trader from, a 3-month period in 2012 or whatever it was. And just how he's the cleverest bloke in the world and all the rest of that stuff that really annoys me, and I'm sure really annoys a few of you. But if you want to bring me any comments, if you want to tag Gary in this video, if you're a mate of his, please do, because I would bloody love to have a chat with him. And I will leave it there for this week. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And I'll see you again next week. Cheers.